Good evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Spectre Journal to this evening's discussion on Marxism in the Anthropocene, Degrowth Communism, and the Ecosocialist strategy. My name's Charles Post. I'm an editor of Spectre Journal, which is sponsoring this event. I want to start by thanking all of our donors, many of whom are on this will be participating in this initial discussion for their support, financial support, which is making the continued publication of Spectre as a physical journal possible. I also want to let folks know, especially those of you who are be watching this later on, that we are planning for the spring introducing the panel and the panelists. And the idea for this panel came out of, in response to the reading of Kohei Saito's recent book, Marx and the Anthropocene, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. That book spurred renewed interest in Marx's ecological thought and ignited further controversy over a number of key debates on the contemporary left around the issues of left eco-theory. Most notably, it sparked a debate between what is often described on the one side as Marxist ecomodernism and what Kohei has dubbed degrowth communism. Now, in this event, we're going to have three speakers. Our first speaker is Kohei Saito, who's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo. He's the author of, in English, Marx's Ecosocialism, Marx and the Anthropocene, and most recently, Slow Down, the Deceleration Manifesto. We also have with us Holly Jean Buck, who is an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Buffalo. She's an environmental social scientist whose research focuses on public engagement with emerging climate and energy technologies. She's the author of After Geoengineering, which Verso published in 2019, and Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough, from Verso in 2021. And she holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University. And finally, we have Dan Boscov-Ellen, who is both an assistant professor of philosophy at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and a affiliated editor of Spectre. His background is in environmental theory and critical theory and philosophy, and he's currently working on a book about the ethics of climate change, provisionally entitled Critical Climate Ethics, Capitalism, Colonialism, and the Climate Crisis. Now, we're going to start off. Each of our speakers is going to have approximately 10 minutes to make an opening statement. After each speaker, that will be in order of Kohei, Holly, and then Dan. Then each of the speakers will have 5 minutes to respond to one another, and then we're going to open up for about 30 minutes for questions and answers from our donors in the audience. So why don't we get started? Kohei, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you for introduction, Charles. This is Kohei Saito. I'm pretty excited about today's session. Good morning. I'm here. It's 9 a.m. in Japan, but now we can use Skype to connect to all over the world. And I want to present two of my books. One is Marx in the Anthropocene, and the other was Slow Down, which just came out in January. And these two books have very similar aim. One is more academic, the other is more for popular audience, but the aim is to present the idea of degrowth communism as a new political imaginary for the left, because this is something we really need, because in the age of climate breakdown, capitalism is an obvious root cause, and we need to challenge capitalism. And luckily, there are many post-capitalist imaginaries recently, from ecomodernism to degrowth. And basically, my book's intervention in this debate from a Marxist socialist side. And traditionally, there are many discussions on this kind of topic, but famously enough, there's a long-lasting antagonism between green environmental movements on the one hand and the red workers socialist movements on the other hand. And fortunately, this antagonism has been somewhat resolved by people like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Bucket, who recently passed away. And I also did my intervention in my last book, my previous book, Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, which was published from Monthly Review Press, by looking at Marx's own unpublished notebooks. He actually very intensively studied natural sciences at the time. He read, for example, Justus von Liebig, the agricultural chemistry, and he analyzed how modern capitalist agriculture actually creates a serious disruption in the metabolic interaction between humans and nature. And he demanded that capitalism cannot solve this metabolic rift. So we need to make a transition to a more sustainable planned society, which we call ecosocialism. So my book was titled Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, and it got Deutsche Prize and so on. However, I had at the time two serious problems. One is basically, so even if I or Foster Bucket demonstrated Marx was an ecological thinker, some people said, so what? It's 19th century science, only dogmatic Marxists care about what Marx said. So for people like me, it's important that Marx was ecologist, but for many left-wing people or for liberal people, it doesn't matter whether Marx was ecologist or not. That was one criticism. But my response basically in these two recent books, Marx in the Anthropocene and Slow Down, is no, it's important because based on his analysis of metabolic rift and environmental destruction and so on, we can imagine a new future. Without Marx's ecology, we cannot have a thorough critique of contemporary climate breakdown and so on. And I wanted to demonstrate how his theory is useful in order to comprehend today's climate crisis and so on. And secondly, there was another tension, even after overcoming the tension between green and red. The tension that existed was the tension between ecosocialism on the one hand and degrowth people. Because many socialists still believe that more technology, more innovations, and more growth are necessary for any kind of emancipatory socialist politics. And they also believe that the degrowth is not critical enough of capitalism, and degrowth is only for rich people. And, so they believe that the degrowth is not really useful for working class movements and the people in the global south and so on. And on the other hand, degrowth people criticize, like before, that the socialists are basically only concerned about growth and technology, and that they are basically productivists. And that's true to some extent, because some socialists argue like that when they especially criticize degrowth people. But I believe that this tension is very unfortunate, because today, even degrowth people recognize that the capitalism is very problematic, and they also demand more radical transformation to the economic system, while socialists often stick to their own old tradition. Then the dialogue doesn't take place, and I wanted to kind of overcome this tension in order to build a wider new anti-capitalist front in the age of climate breakdown. So that was my project. And this is a result presented in the Marx in the Anthropocene. that was a little bit hard because, in looking at the tradition of Marxism, there was always very optimistic belief in terms of developing or increasing productive forces will one day blow up capitalist model production. So the old traditional historical materialism is indeed very productivist, always increase of productive forces first, and then we will solve other problems, including ecological degradation. But if you look at Marx's own discussion, he changes his ideas over time because he was also studying new things, and one is exactly natural science. And once he recognized ecological question, the ecological degradation under capitalism, and this view only came to his mind around 1860s, so relatively late, around the time of preparing for volume 1 to 3 of Capital, he recognized that actually this kind of increase of productive forces and technologies are only strengthening, reinforcing robbery from nature. It is not bringing emancipation. It is not realizing any kind of sustainable society. It is simply robbing nature of its wealth, right? So he started to question his old assumption about traditional historical materialism. And then he also started to take a look at pre-capitalist societies again. Once in the 50s, he was more optimistic. All those pre-capitalist society will be destroyed by capitalist imperialism. That's bad, but one day there will be also revolution and socialism will spread all over the world and so on. But in the 70s, when he studied countries like Russia and America, indigenous communities, and Poland, and so on, he came to recognize actually that this society, people are not only equal because they regulated all the kind of production on communal level, but also this kind of society remained stable for many, many years, in some cases, thousands of years, because the society, the community itself is very sustainable. While capitalism transforms itself all the time, but then they're also destroying the entire planet. So when he compared these two different kinds of dynamism of social reproduction, he came to recognize in the end, actually, pre-capitalist society had some kind of economic superiority, and he even demanded in his letter to Deceleration that Western capitalism must go back, must return to the higher stage of pre-capitalist societies. So he says that the Western capitalist countries need to learn from pre-capitalist non-Western societies, and then there will be future. Not simply going back to, low technology kind of thing, return to the higher stage. And then he said, yes, 1 minute left, he said that in the communist societies, all the springs of commonwealth, genossenschaftliche Reichtum, the commonwealth, flow more abundantly. Here, I find a new form of abundance flowing out. It is not the private jet for everyone. It is more about education, medical care, services, food, electricity, and these essential goods must be communally owned, decommodified, and that kind of public luxury, public abundance is the basis of communism. And then it is not necessary to always seek after economic growth. And that transformation he made in the very last stage of his life is the foundation of degrowth communism. And this is something what we today, the left, need to embrace and put forward as a new emancipatory alternative politics.
Thank you, Kohei. Jean, you're up next. Ali, you're up next, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reflect on this book, Marx and the Anthropocene, but congrats on the new one. I haven't read it yet. And I wanted to start out just by saying that I'm deeply appreciative of the scholarship and of the effort it takes to go through all of these texts and discover and convey these new insights. I appreciate the argument that Marx later in life became a degrowth communist. Sounds good to me. I haven't read all of those letters or manuscripts, so I wouldn't know how to evaluate that argument. neither am I planning to read those manuscripts. I'll say for context that getting on to be 15 years ago, I was a student of Jason Moore and Andreas Malm and Alf Hornberg when I lived in Sweden. And so I had a point of context for all the engagements throughout this text with their work and the work of others. But I decided it was not my destiny to read Marx in a granular way. So I appreciate it when other people take that on. So I won't talk about that. What I will talk about is the role of technology in this book, as well as a couple of other questions that came to mind while I was reading it. And I'm thinking about this with an eye towards what we want readers to go out and do after they engage with a work like this. How does it develop or inform a political program on the ground? And so what I observed is that there's some slippage between technology, geoconstructivism or intervention, and Prometheanism, which is described as absolute domination over nature, and also production. At times these are mentioned, but they felt conflated with each other and also with capitalism at times. And I think that they are different things. They're obviously related in some ways, but I do think you can have complex or large-scale technology and even thoughtful human interventions into socio-ecological systems without necessarily having domination or having this Promethean attitude. So which of these is really the problem? I think domination, I think the social relations and ecological relations involved in that. And so at times I felt like there's kind of technological determinism. Like by that, I mean this idea that technology is this autonomous, inevitable driving force, like a train you can't get off. And so there are, some quotes, for example, Barry Commoner, in each case, the new technology worsened the environmental impact of the economic good, like this view that, technology is inevitably going to make environments worse or that it can't be controlled. And to me, it's not clear why sometimes these characteristics, like being capital intensive or large scale, aren't going to be compatible with democracy. So I think that, why is some of these trends or this conflation around technological determinism and technology plus capitalism rolled up together a problem? I think the first thing that came to mind is that if you were to do social planning to the extent that you would need to move into and then execute degrowth communism or agrarian communism, you have this social technology of being able to make collective decisions, of being able to, direct your environment in some way. And if you develop that capacity that we need to get to this revolution, you would also have the ability to shape technologies, in my view. I don't know why you wouldn't if you had that well-developed social infrastructure. So if you're able to do social planning, then it follows you can exert influence on how these technologies develop. And within one of the subfields I work in, science and technology studies, technological determinism has been roundly critiqued for many years. Obviously, technology under capitalism has sucked. I would say that's because capitalism sucks. And then people say, oh, well, what about technology in the Soviet Union and the Aral Sea and the ecological damage? And to that, I'd say, the way technology development has played out isn't the only inevitable way. We have like an N of one in some ways. If we look at our past experience of a couple hundred years of industrial civilization, I think that's a very limited guide to what's possible. We've experienced it unfold in one particular way. There could be other ways. The second challenge here is I think that we need all sorts of things in the portfolio for addressing the ecological crisis. And I was thinking about this line in the book that says, technological solutions are attractive because they do not entail us changing our current lifestyle, which I think is a bit of a false binary because we need to do everything. And so I was thinking about this famous paper in 2004 in Science by Pakula and Solico. This is a paper that introduced this concept of the stabilization wedges. And basically, it's called Stabilization Wedges, Solving the Climate Problem for the Next 50 Years with Current Technologies. And this was a super influential framework for how everybody's thought about climate policy since, actually. But their point in this paper is that you don't need to wait for some future fantastic thing to tackle climate change. We have the technologies we need to do it. And they had all of these wedges, each of them dealing with a certain amount of emissions to stabilize warming. And we've evolved from that framework, basically. But in a way, that paper distanced us from some of these debates about particular technologies versus others, because it showed that you need all of these things. And I think it's very clear that, you know, we can't address climate change without dealing with land use and methane emissions from livestock, and there has to be dietary changes. Like, there's no workaround for that. But also, I think we need nuclear energy. I think we need some of these more high capital technologies to provide a decent quality of life for people. And I don't think these are necessarily opposed. I think we need all of them. The other challenge I'll mention is that I think degrowth needs some forms of technology, especially some forms of energy technology, to be politically appealing to people, which I guess is a point of contention. And I was wondering at some places what forms of technology might be attractive. There's a brief discussion on page 157 of these open and locking technologies as one way to think about it. So open technologies being ones that promote communication, cooperation, and interaction on a wide scale. That might be a useful framework for thinking about it. I think what's really important is the social relations around the technologies rather than the technologies themselves. And so I was thinking also about some of the absences of the book that maybe your other work or maybe other people's work answer or speak to. One was just energy, how we think about energy. There's a lot of metabolism in the book, but not so much about energy. And my suggestion for degrowth advocates, I'm not one, but I respect their inquiries. Maybe think about focusing on universal basic energy as a way to communicate or think about a desirable. I think it's part of an abundance agenda, but also something that could garner more popular support. Another question I had while reading is it really about degrowth or agrarian communes? Maybe the degrowth aspect could have been spelled out more. And then obviously the question is, how do you get from 8 billion people to agrarian communes? Is there some kind of sinister, horrific magic wand that decreases the population? I don't know. I'm sure degrowth advocates are tired of having to speak to this, but I do think every time we speak about degrowth, it would be nice to have that more clear. And then obviously the other challenges with degrowth, as I spoke to, the political appeal, but also the way it could be used to justify austerity politics. So what are the safeguards against that can be built into this agenda? So I'll just wrap up by saying that I think we have this creative challenge to formulate what technology looks like without domination or capitalism. And how do we embrace human agency? We need human agency if we were to build degrowth communism or other things. If we have that, why wouldn't we also use it to shape better technologies in service of the public good? So some of my wonderings, and I'm glad I got the chance to, and the prompt to engage with this text. It was a really interesting read. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. Dan, all yours.
All right. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to everybody for being here, and to the donors for helping to keep Spectre going and viable. So in my comments today, I want to build a bit on a line of questioning that I advanced in an article in the most recent print edition of Spectre, which is entitled Marxism in the Anthropocene, Historical Materialism and the Ambivalence of Value Theory. And I want to highlight in particular a few key questions that I think that this book, this excellent book, raises for Marxists in the Anthropocene. So in that article, I wrote that this book is essential reading, and I think that it is, for anybody who wants to better understand the evolution and contemporary resonance of Marx's ecological thought. And as we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, the book also touches on and has sort of stirred up, I think, interesting discussions about a number of key debates within contemporary left eco theory, particularly the one that we've started to hear a little bit about already between degrowth and ecomodernism on the socialist left. But in my view, I think like the core of the argument that I'm building off of here is that the rapid deterioration of planetary ecology has pretty decisively demonstrated that, as Kohei puts it, capitalism is no longer progressive in the sense of preparing the material grounds for communism. Instead, it actually destroys the general conditions of production and reproduction upon which all life depends. And that reality seems to render Marx's view of historical progress, at least as it's sort of traditionally understood, as he says, hopelessly outdated. And I think the book does really impressive work to demonstrate that the later Marx actually already had recognized this problem precociously. So Kohei argues that once Marx, quote, started to question the progressive role of increasing productive forces under capitalism, he was inevitably compelled to challenge his own earlier progressive view of history, unquote. So unfortunately, of course, Marx died before he was able to actually complete the difficult work of reformulating the theory. But the book suggests that the degrowth communism towards which Marx turned is the only viable position for us to take today. So that's sort of like the starting point here. I find the Marxological instrument argument both fascinating and largely convincing. And I'm also largely in agreement with the political conclusions. I also think that this account raises some crucial and difficult questions for Marxists that I want to just sort of call attention to here. Centrally, Professor Saito suggests that many ecomodernists naively identify human well-being with capitalist material abundance having, quote, uncritically accepted existing value standards and consumerist ideals. So the idea here, right, is that they criticize degrowth for just being pro-austerity because there's sort of an assumption that if you don't have, endlessly increasing material wealth, that this is actually just enforced scarcity. And he suggests a different understanding of scarcity and abundance, which he also derives from Marx, right? Arguing that for Marx himself, wealth is something very different from its appearance within capitalism as an immense collection of commodities. Folks will know from the beginning of Capital One. And that this critique of political economy that he lays out would be, quote, inconsistent and mediocre if he so naively endorsed bourgeois values, Marx, that is. So by arguing that Marx ultimately outgrew those values, the argument is basically that we as Marxists should as well. And he posits that post-capitalism needs to invent wholly different value standards and social behaviors such that, quote, instead of wanting destructive, extravagant, and wasteful products, people will desire healthier, more solidaristic and democratic ways of living, which sounds great. So my article is basically considering what that undertaking might entail in the context of this radical revision of Marx's understanding of historical progress towards communism. So communism here is still the negation of the negation that abolishes capitalist private property and replaces it with communal production of a higher sort while retaining the positive fruits of capitalist development. But the negation to be negated is understood here primarily as the metabolic rift opened by capitalism, a contradiction that can only be sublated by the reestablishment of the original unity of humans and nature on a higher scale. But because the superiority of this higher form of communism can no longer derive from the development of its productive forces in the service of material abundance, this necessarily raises questions of value, because if capitalism's economic and technological development is not inherently progressive in the way that traditional historical materialism had assumed, then there's a question of in what sense the positive fruits of capitalist development lay the grounds for a higher form of communism. By what standards are we judging social progress after the rejection of productivist and Eurocentric historical materialism? And this need for new normative standards also, I think, points to larger questions of motivation and agency, because it's no longer obvious who's meant to effect this negation of the negation, or for what reasons. In the orthodox story, right, this is pretty clear. You have structural, aside from certain structural counter tendencies or contingencies, capitalism's progressive development would tend to produce the conditions of its own self-overcoming, right? The deeper rationalities of capital's logic fetter the growth of productive forces or lead to declining rates of profit. They create economic crises alongside increasing inequality. The workers are organized like armies in the factories, you get, et cetera, right? You guys know the story. But few of those material motive forces seem to survive wholly intact in this version. So, and I'm raising this question again, not to defend the orthodox view at all. I fully agree that it's non-viable today, and that Marx, as Kohei puts it, a Marxian vision of a post-scarcity society adequate to the Anthropocene must look quite different. But what I want to highlight is the way in which this account raises questions about what Marxists value, our reasons for holding and ranking these values, and how we might persuade others to adopt and fight for them. One of the questions that we run into in trying to do this is that Marxists tend to believe that our values are inescapably shaped by the world around us. And it seems clear that in capitalist society, that process is characterized particularly by our alienation from the rest of nature and from the production of the things that we consume. So it might seem difficult to imagine a way forward for the project of degrowth communism, insofar as it seems to put the normative ideological horse ahead of the material social cart. At least ecomodernism seems to have a much easier task insofar as it's aiming to give people more of what they already allegedly want, rather than sort of fundamentally altering their values and desires. So it seems like we have our work cut out for us. And there are reasons to think that it actually might be even more difficult that I'll get to in a minute. But I also think that there may actually be some reason to hope. The situation is actually not the same as it was, in Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, or even Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. As this more recent book, and also its sort of like critical public success show, there is an increasing skepticism about capitalism, particularly among younger people, even in the global north. And that's not only because it's failed to deliver on its promise of ever-growing material abundance for many of us. I think it's also because much of the abundance that our society does produce is rapidly destroying the world and deepening alienation. So when we look beneath the facade of complacent consumerism these days, I think we may find that many people actually already long for alternatives to which they have not put a name, alternatives abundant in goods we already want, but that no capitalist can truly sell us. So I think the task of radical politics is not to pander to complacent consumerism, but to tap into the deeper desires for which it substitutes and to mobilize them towards emancipatory goals. The question is how we do that. It looks like I have 1 minute left, so I want to just briefly say one last thing. Which is that I appreciate that in both of these books, Kohei suggests that movements in the global north need to learn from and work in solidarity with indigenous movements and the global south in building alternatives to capitalism. But I want to ask whether we actually, in doing that and doing it seriously, might need to effect even a deeper interrogation of certain aspects of the Marxist tradition. And in the article, I talk a little bit about anthropocentrism. I think that both of these books rightly argue for a return to the commons and production for use rather than exchange value. But I worry a little bit that the non-human world still figures here primarily as a source of use values that is to be preserved for future humans, but doesn't seem to figure into the norms of democratic decision-making or to play an important role in the vision of good relations. And I had similar questions about the role of future generations here and different conceptions of temporality and history, but I think we can save that for the Q&A. Anyway, thank you very much for this really exciting work, and I look forward to talking about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. And Kohei, you've got 5 minutes to respond to anything, elaborate, etc. Please.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Holly and Dan, first of all, for reading my book and giving a wonderful comments. And yeah, exactly that kind of conversation and dialogues I wanted to have. So I'm really happy for this occasion today. And I think one of the things that I wanted to respond is that the degrowth is not actually about going back to agrarian communism. That Marx was inspired by those agrarian communes doesn't mean that he idealized it as a kind of vision for future. He's getting some inspirations for envisioning a higher type of communism. And so that's not actually going back to the nature, which means that it's not about negating all the kind of technologies as aiming for absolute domination of nature. His point is basically under capitalism, as you rightly pointed out, Holly, under this capitalist social relation, technologies are often developed for the sake of dominating people, dominating nature. So it is often associated with Prometheanism. But I would say that there are many ways that in another kind of social relations, like a socialist relations of production, we can have complex technologies that are non-dominant, that can be more democratically managed. And these are the things that, for example, renewable energies are obvious example that we definitely need in order to realize decarbonization. So degrowth people are actually demanding massive investment in renewable energies, electric vehicles, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we aim for infinite growth. And we can also talk about reducing number of cars. We can also reduce general consumption of energy and so on, so that we can have something like a universal basic energy for everyone. And we can debate about the nuclear energy because I don't actually support nuclear energy after the experience of Fukushima in Japan. So in a sense, the degrowth people demand dissolution of that kind of gigantic centralized kind of technology, which Andre Gotz characterized as lock-in technology, and we can have some kind of open technology that can be more democratically managed, even though it's complex. I mean, there are many ways, I would say. I'm not a specialist of technology, but it's at least possible to imagine something like that. But we need to add that this also must be sustainable. There can be democratic technologies that are aiming at absolute domination of nature. So, simply open doesn't mean it's sufficient. It doesn't mean sustainable. So we need to have a very different kind of technology that we can have in degrowth kind of society. So I think that, people like Matt Huber also sometimes misunderstand that point. It's not about negation of technology, going back to agrarian society, and it's not about austerity, but it is about negation of absolute domination of nature, negation of infinite economic growth, and then negation of those fundamental desires. It's connected to the question raised by Dan. It is the negation of some of our core values that we actually take consciously or unconsciously from capitalist system. For example, the material consumption, and we should have. We should own cars and so on. And it's also very hard. The degrowth is about distinguishing necessary and unnecessary things, and we consciously plan to reduce those unnecessary things so that we can stay somehow within planetary boundaries. But who would decide what is unnecessary? For some people, I say, SUVs are not necessary, but for some people, maybe they feel strongly that they are necessary for their lives. So the negation of meat, negation of big cars, negation of air flights could be very aggressive, and it could appeal as undemocratic. So it is hard indeed, as Dan pointed out, to imagine or start actually some kind of degrowth politics in a concrete way. It's hard to motivate people, especially for the people in the global north. But at the same time, unless we challenge this difficult task, the crisis is so huge, so the solution must be difficult too. The time of my hesitation about Green New Deal is like people like Robert Pauling said, the crisis is so huge, but then invest 1% of our GDP in renewable energies, and then the problem will be solved. So it's not that hard. Okay, you said that it's an existential crisis of civilization and human beings, but then the solution, Green New Deal, sounds so easy. I think it has to be, the solution also has to be something difficult, and this is a very challenging task. We need to talk about motivation, agency, and the re-evaluation of value system. But that's something that we need to discuss right now because it takes time, but I think this is a very important starting point.
Holly, go ahead. Thank you, Kohei. Holly.
Thank you. I think I appreciate that point that Marx's reflections on the agrarian economies were, an inspiration, and he wasn't necessarily a romantic, and it's not about going back to nature. I think like some readers, I was really hoping for an affective description of what it would be like to live in a degrowth commune, coupled with more details about how things might be organized. But I also realized that you have to in some ways leave that open because those choices are up to the people who are building these, and also B, this is a scholarly project that spent the first two parts really delving deeply into Marx. So maybe, the deep description of what it's like to live there is probably in an existing or forthcoming work, or to be filled in by the rest of us. So thank you for those comments.
Dan.
Hey. All right. So wow, yeah, there's a lot here, and I probably won't be able to touch on all of it. I wanted to return first to something that was brought up in Holly's comments about what was seen as sort of like the conflation between, or the slippage between, technology, productivism, and capitalism. And just to sort of like ask or raise as something for the discussion to come, what people view as the relationship between technologies and mode of production, right? So like on some versions of Marx, if you just go to sort of like the kind of prototypical like orthodox formulation of historical materialism from G.A. Cohen, right? You have like the development of the forces of production at a certain stage. You get fettering, and there's sort of like an autonomy of the forces of production and technologies, where they seem to operate sort of like semi-independently of relations of production. And I think like one of the questions that comes up for me here is, can we just say, well, technologies aren't good or bad. It's really just the fact that, like capitalists are using them in bad ways. And if we, sort of are the ones pulling the levers, then things will be fine. I worry that, the real subsumption has advanced to a degree that like those technologies are often fairly fundamentally shaped by the uses to which they're put. And of course, like, we can adapt and retrofit things. But I do just want to sort of like raise a question about both whether we want to characterize technologies as just like simply neutral tools, or whether they have sort of like deeper ties to the relations of production in which they're produced. You can think about that with respect to like AI, but like lots of other stuff going on right now. energy technologies. And I also just wanted to ask whether you think that there is any merit to the idea that the faith in technology, as Kohei suggests, might function ideologically to prevent us from imagining different kinds of social transformations. That is, like that. On the one hand, we don't want to sort of just rule out technology dogmatically, certain technologies dogmatically, but on the other hand, we may want to be attuned to the ways in which they're constraining the way that we think about our political projects. And if you would take that on board, do you think that there are ways of sort of incorporating that into your argument? For Kohei, I was sort of intrigued by, in particular, the last thing that you said about the difficulty and nonetheless the need to sort of take the time that's necessary to do this despite the difficulties, and not sort of just being seduced by the urgency of the situation pushing us into pragmatism. And it reminded me of there's an article by Karl, which some folks here may be familiar with. It's called I think it's called Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice or something like that, where he's basically arguing that we've already sort of passed the relational tipping points that are relevant a long time ago, and that in order to actually have climate justice that's meaningful for many indigenous peoples, those kinds of relationships are going to have to be repaired, and that's not something that can happen quickly, and that the sort of ticking clock in front of us actually sort of distracts us from that deeper but necessary project. So I think in general, the title of the book, Slow Down, I liked, and I want to push on a little bit in terms of thinking about the way that the temporalities of anti-capitalism might work differently from capitalist time. But that's something we can maybe talk about as the rest of the discussion proceeds.
Okay. Just want to make a note to myself. This is a great kickoff, a lot of stuff on the table, and I've gotten several questions in from the audience, and I want to sort of try to group them around a couple of themes. And the first one is to the theme that seems to be a theme that has already come up, which is the question of what is the relationship between the way in which humans organize their relationships to one another and technology. One of the questions we got said that both ecomodernist and degrowth solutions often tend to appear as technical solutions, although neither approach needs to appear as a technical solution. So what is the role of and I'd like to throw this particularly to both Holly and Kohei, how do you understand the ways in which the relationship between various forms of technology, the relationship of humans to nature, and to what extent are they in fact shaped by the relations between humans, social relations, class relations, and to what extent do they have an independent existence? So why don't I throw that back to both Holly and Kohei, whoever would like to start it off.
Yeah, let me briefly introduce my argument in chapter 5 of the Capital, Marx in the Anthropocene, because Dan also mentioned the problem of real subsumption, and we have from the 70s debates about whether socialism can actually use nuclear power, and some people say no, we can have nuclear energy because once we have different kind of social relations, we can manage nuclear power in a different way, and it can be safe, it can be democratically managed, and so on. And those people seem to believe that the social relations and technologies are actually two different things. And once we replace social relations with some other kind of relations, the technology can be used for the sake of other people and more just and fair way. And in chapter 5, I actually argued, no, this is not necessarily what Marx was thinking about, because his discussion of the real subsumption actually says that the social relation becomes thingified, become reified within technology. It materialized. So in the sense that the way how the technology develops and how the technology concretizes itself is wholly mediated by the logic of capital. And then even we try to manage those technology in a democratic way in the future society, in the future post-capitalist society. We cannot, because these technologies are not neutral. It is designed from nature to be undemocratic and to be dominating nature and humans, and so on. So I think in the sense that we need to talk about, I think if this logic of real subsumption is correct, we have to think about abandoning some of the technologies that we have today. They cannot be transformed into some kind of democratic and sustainable technologies anyway. So I think this is the beginning point for Marx to question his own earlier optimistic vision of historical materialism. Always technologies are progressive and so on.
Okay. Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree somewhat, and I want to also fold some comments that Dan made into my response. I don't think that technologies are totally neutral. I wouldn't say that, because the technologies we have been shaped by particular sets of social relations. And so my thinking is not that they are, free from that. They've been made by that. It's more that you could imagine and enact an alternative form of them. And so I don't think it's useful to think of them as good or bad. I know people use that as kind of a heuristic, but take, for example, something like hydrogen. You can think about so-called blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from natural gas with carbon capture and storage. There's at least two reasons why I don't think we should be producing that. I don't think it's a desirable technology. I think we should turn away. One is that it's just not a good choice for the climate for a bunch of reasons I won't go into. But the other reason is it's really being shaped and used by different fossil fuel actors that have a bad track record and don't need any more profits from us. And then people say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't have hydrogen. Actually, I think we need it for decarbonizing steel. I think steel is really important to have. And then they say, okay, green hydrogen is the good hydrogen, blue hydrogen is the bad hydrogen. By green hydrogen, I mean hydrogen made from electrolysis, from water. And I don't think that, you could have green hydrogen that's also bad if somebody appropriated a whole bunch of land for the solar panels without consulting people, or if it's depleting water sources. It's really about how it emerges. It doesn't adhere in the technology.
Okay, Dan, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I guess the only thing that I would have to add here is I think I agree that there needs to, just saying like something is like flatly good or bad is often not helpful. But I think, like even in these comments, there's room to be able to say, well, we can have like a variety of reasons for thinking that some of these things are better than others, right? So you like gave some here, and I think that those can include what kinds of social and ecological relations different kinds of technology encourage, right? So I think like we were sort of quick at the beginning to dismiss the idea that we want to sort of like just have a return to nature or whatever, but there might actually be something important to technologies that at least try to reduce the alienation of people from the cycles of the world around them, right? Just for one example. And that's not to say like that renewables that, like solar and wind that are sort of, dependent on those things are inherently like, beneficent and we don't have to worry about them, right? Of course, like the most recent like conference of indigenous peoples at the UN, the main thing that they were talking about was the concern around mining related to renewables, right? So there's certainly like large potential issues of environmental justice involved there as well. There's questions of like whether those are like totally non-locking technologies too. But I just want to suggest that I think like we have a number of criteria for being able to say, actually, like some of these technologies are much more compatible with the kind of post-capitalist society we want to see than others. Maybe.
Okay. There's a couple more questions relating to various technologies, techno-optimism, which I'll hold to a bit later, because I hope people could sort of talk about some of the issues of strategy. And there are two questions that have come from the audience that I want to read out and get people's response to. The first question is, quote, I'd be curious to hear speakers talk about the role of value standards and changes in behavior. Are they important in your view of left strategy in a future world? If so, how? If not, why not? How might values be determined and rooted? Also, do you think it's important to find different ways of, okay, we'll leave that till later on the non-human world. But then there's another question here question that says, in relation to the problem, quote, how to motivate workers to overthrow capitalism, I think that the experience of dignity, denial, and loneliness most workers and others face, together with the miseries of work and poverty in capitalist crises, the horrors of climate change, the emerging pandemics, provides a lot of motivation. However, this does not address the difficulty of the political processes through which to organize the overthrow of capitalism. I think the question here is trying to get to how do we go from current struggles, whether they're in the workplace, et cetera, against poverty, precarity, et cetera, to this eco-socialist future. Marx envisioned that it was through their workers' collective self and democratic self-activity that they cast off the muck of ages, they become fit to rule, they change themselves in the process of struggle. How do you envision so that it doesn't come simply through adapting good ideas, good values, good morality? So I'd like each of the three speakers to talk about how they envision current struggles becoming these ecological struggles. Go ahead, Kohei.
I touch on that topic more in Slow Down book. My difference from the traditional reading is that I focus on the theory of metabolism, not the theory of exploitation. If we remain in the old paradigm of exploitation, I think the conception of revolutionary subjectivity is limited to the working class. And this is, often criticized, male dominant, productivist, and so on. But if we expand the sphere to the entire process of metabolic interaction between humans and nature, the one who get affected is not just workers, but also women, indigenous people, all the other kind of non-humans, including, global north and south and so on. So that is the entire sphere that is exploited or robbed by the logic of capital can be the starting point of resistance. And so I wanted to highlight that importance of theory of metabolism for imagining a new strategy. And actually, my concrete strategy is often criticized, not revolutionary enough, but I respond to those critics by saying that my proposal is aiming at non-reformist reforms, as Andre Gortz once said. It's about decomodifying essential goods and services and creating or expanding, re-establishing the sphere of commonwealth. Many things are commodified and privately owned under capitalism, so we need to pay for those goods, essential goods and services. And for that, we need to work hard, and our life is very unstable. But once we starting to decommodify and making the public goods, and these things become publicly luxurious, publicly abundant for many people, because we can have free medical care, free education, free electricity, and free public transportation, free internet, then we will probably start behaving in a different way. We don't have to be only thinking about money, survival in the market competition, and that kind of egoistic behavior can be weakened, and maybe we have more room for engaging with public services, more political activities. And these things are not necessarily the case, of course. This is a little bit utopian, but at the same time, many things are really commodified in the US, in Japan, and compared to the European societies, the value standards are very different. And I think it's not coincidental that the degrowth is making a greater resonance in the European countries than in the US. So I think by decommodification, by making these public goods kind of commonwealth, is a very important starting point for the left strategy for changing behavior and value standards in the global north.
Okay, Holly?
So I think in terms of left strategy, I wouldn't start with changing in behavior in the way that people typically think about it. I think the first starting place should be with industry, because that's like 30% of emissions and you don't have to influence so many actors. And so that's number one, and that buys a couple of years to start to build more political power and shared norms, shared values. I think that changes that enhance the visibility of things that need to happen. So for example, you have local municipalities, you want to put heat pumps in their buildings, but you want the public to see somehow that there's a heat pump there or a solar panel or whatever, so that they're aware of these things. That's another first step. And then I think you need to build these public luxuries. So build a really awesome communal swimming pool, and then people won't have their own swimming pools, or they'll be more likely to give it up because it's fun to go to the social experience that's beautiful, right? Or build, housing that's attractive, that's smaller and more efficient. And then that change in behavior from buying a big mansion in the middle of nowhere to being like where the action is, that change will happen more organically. And I could go through lots of examples, but I think that when I think about changing behavior, those are the entrance points I start to think about.
Great. So yeah, and I think there's like a lot of overlap here in terms of one of the things that I think is interesting is, I think there are also relevant differences, but I do think that many of us have, sort of like common things that we find to try. I was reading in Slowdown, I was trying to find the page on here where you're like, rather than just, like sitting in front of a computer constantly working on, for somebody else's deadline and then like microwaving your dinner or whatever, we could have time to like cook. And, and I was like, wow, that sounds like really, really nice, right? That's, I know I'm not alone in thinking that. So I think the program of trying to give people, things that they actually recognize as attractive and speak to desires that they already have is super important, right? I do also think, and I think that the component of making value arguments can't just be removed, and this is something that, particularly given that there's going to be different positionalities to many of these different actors, right? So you're going to need, I think, both arguments that speak to the sort of like different situations of the people involved, but also in some respects, like people in some positions in the global north may have to change some aspects of their lives that on their own they might prefer not to, in recognition of the sort of like deep injustices and harms that they're causing. And so I think there is an inescapable moral element to this, even if that's not sort of like what we want to rely upon as the primary driving force of political change, right? I think that like many Marxists are sort of like allergic to this sort of thing because they want to just say like scientific socialism versus the kind of like moralistic utopian socialism. But this is in the article I mentioned. I think actually Cohen is sort of right about one thing when he says we cannot rely on technology to fix things for us. If they can be fixed, then we have to fix them through hard theoretical and political labor. We consequently have to be far more clear than we were about what we are seeking, how we're justified in seeking it, and how it can be implemented institutionally. And of course, we're not going to win political fights by making better philosophical arguments. But part of the challenge there is imagining and building political movements that are able to make those kinds of arguments effectively to their constituents. Maybe that can get us into the question of politics more broadly, because I think all of us are arguing that this needs to be a political project, but we may have different understandings of exactly what that means and what it might look like.
Yes, and actually that gets to the question that I just received from our audience, which is who is the agent of the process of decommodification? What is the agency of building public luxuries? What does this mean in terms of concrete organizing? Do people see this as primarily what we could call a state-led process affected by changing the minds of or the personnel of the current state? Or is this the result of people's more tumultuous social disruption from below? In other words, try to get at what is it concrete, what is the sort of political agents and agency we're looking for in this transition to an eco-socialist world, whether we conceive it primarily as degrowth or some variant of ecomodernism. So, Kohei, why don't you start off again?
Yeah, it's not either or. It's not just simply about communal bottom-up organizing that can transform this planetary crisis, right? So it has to be built up, and then the state needs to also plan accordingly to shut down coal fire plants, and we also need to plan how we can actually end fossil fuel entirely. And this is not something that local groups can do. So we need also a kind of top-down intervention in the entire process of production. And I think this is how the both sides, socialist side and degrowth side, can learn from each other, because degrowth people often emphasize the kind of bottom-up communities, eco-village, and those kind of small-scale democratic horizontal things. And these are all very important, but at the same time, it is not sufficient to tackle this planetary crisis. So I think the socialist tradition of even like a calculation debate about what we produce and the role of the state is very central in the discussion of Marxist and socialist tradition. So I think degrowth people need to learn from that Marxist aspect too. But the problem is there's this fundamental kind of misunderstanding, mistrust to each other. And then my book is basically the first intervention from a Marxist side, by demonstrating the kind of the attitude that Marxism can also not only contribute to degrowth people, but also can learn from many things and present a more concrete vision of alliance for a better future. So, I mean, unionism is obviously important, and Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, all those kind of environmental justice movements also important. But at the same time, unionism and climate justice movement somehow need to cooperate and learn from each other. And this is not unfortunately taking place. And I think this is a real challenge after years of climate justice movements. They are not scaling up enough, and then many activists are having some kind of dissatisfaction with the current way. And I have been having a lot of discussion how we do scale up and what kind of subjectivity, what kind of strategies. I don't have a full answer, I have to admit, but this is something that we can find a solution only by overcoming this antagonism between degrowth and ecosocialism.
Okay, Holly?
Yes, so I think one thing we can do is focus on building this connective infrastructure, social infrastructure between the federal or the state and local municipalities. Because what I've seen with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, modest as they are in the US compared to the scale of funding we need for clean energy, they do, allow billions of dollars for projects, but you need the expertise in these local places to be able to apply for that money. You need people who have time and vision, and a lot of cash. People are poised to, use it for their own vision, basically.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is a really, of course, this is like both like, the most important and also like the hardest question, probably in some respects. And I don't have all of the answers. I think, and I don't think that there are any sort of like absolute statements that I want to make about it. I think that like sometimes there can be reforms that are made within existing political structures that open up new horizons or that push us in the right direction, even if those aren't the intentions of the people doing it, right? That like sometimes the potential of changes sort of like escape the control of the ruling classes. At the same time, I very much worry about the emphasis on a certain sort of like brand of electoralism that I see in some sectors of the eco-modernist left in particular, where it's sort of like, well, we just need to get, like the electrical workers on our side, and then like all these contradictions will be solved. And there's really, I think, not a sufficient accounting for the like, real structural limitations of existing political forms in particularly in places like the United States. The question of sort of like what it is that we're reproducing or sort of like helping to make viable in these settler colonial societies, right? Is this just sort of like, guaranteeing a future for that colonialism? Are we sufficiently understanding the extractivism and ecological imperialism that are required to be able to maintain these ways of life, et cetera, right? So I think a lot of those questions get tabled when you're focused on that level of political intervention. So I think it can't just be, movements that go out in the street and protest and then fizzle out. But it also can't just be working within existing structures and electing the right politicians to the Democratic Party. So I think that the attempt to build, I think Kohei mentions Cooperation Jackson, and I had an amazing talk here from the founder of Cooperation Jackson a few weeks ago, Callie Kuno, is one really inspiring place to look, where they're trying to sort of like create ways of meeting people's needs, engage at these various different levels, but in a way that prevents their co-optation by sort of like bad actors in the existing political parties. So that's a really tough thing to do, but I think, and throughout the global South, there's also some exciting examples that we could point to. It's not impossible. It's just very hard for us to imagine here, I think.
Okay, we only have about 10, 12 minutes left. And while there's lots more questions that came in, I don't want to open up another round, but I want to give each of the speakers a couple of minutes just to sum up and make any points that you think that folks need to be thinking about coming out of this discussion. So why don't we again start with Kohei?
Yes, one thing I wanted to talk about, we didn't have a chance, is Dan's comments about non-human beings. And in my book, actually, I kind of defend a humanist position because we can only think about non-human beings from human perspective. So we can never really think about beyond, we cannot think beyond our position as humans. So even if we think about sustainability, if we think about other non-human beings, we are still trapped in humanist position. And I think it's very important to recognize that point, especially because today in the more academic discourses, we have a lot of discussion about monist, hybrid kind of understanding. And they often say that this binary of human, non-human, society, nature, are all West-centric, Eurocentric, and some kind of productivist and unecological, so on and so on. And Marx is obviously criticized from that tradition, but I argue that sticking that kind of distinction between human and non-humans or society, natures are also quite essential for imagining new sustainable future, because only humans can make a conscious transition to a post-capitalist society. And this climate crisis is a human problem created by humans, and also could be solved by only humans. So I think it is very important to stay in the humanist position, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can exclude other non-human concerns and interests. So I think it is very important to expand the vision to non-human beings, because Marxism, including myself, often focuses too much on male, Western values and human interests and so on. And I think these criticisms are all valid, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that there are so many things to negate in our tradition. I think we can always learn new things and then build up or refine some of our key arguments, and this will be the same for degrowth ideas. Degrowth has been marginalized even among eco-socialists, but recently John Bellamy Foster also changed his position a little bit, and Monthly Review also highlights the aspect of eco-socialist degrowth, and that kind of things can always happen. The ecology used to be not a central topic for Marxists, but today it is, and I think feminism and other issues are the same. So I think we need to keep updating those values and presenting new strategies, and this is a very good time because more and more people, especially the younger generations, are interested in climate justice and the anti-capitalist struggle. So I think this is really the time for the revival of post-capitalist imaginaries.
Holly?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have too much more to say. I'm grateful for the chance to engage here. I guess I would encourage people to also look more at some of the modeling literature around degrowth scenarios. I didn't do that today, but there's a lot of more papers coming out that are trying to look at potential trajectories to provide decent living standards globally, and thinking about how to stabilize energy demand, these kinds of things. I think that they're work to get through sometimes, but important to think about what a strategy might look like. If you look at the assumptions in these models, some of them have something like a living space of 15 meters squared each per person, or they have different assumptions about caloric intake from meat or whatever. And I think they can be useful tools to help clarify the kinds of things we might be looking for if we're really looking for, a low energy demand, if we're interpreting degrowth to be about those kind of energy figures. So I'll just wrap up by encouraging everybody to review that literature as they have time.
Dan.
Thanks. And yeah, we didn't have a chance to talk about this, but one of the things that I liked in Holly's more recent book was your discussion of I think it was Shell's projections for this, right? Which was like doubling of energy output for the sort of like poorest people and cutting it to like a third in the developed world. Do I have those numbers right, or something
roughly,
like that? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were like, actually, this is like in some respects more radical than like what a lot of the left is arguing for still. I agree that like trying to actually like get some concrete numbers here is really helpful in figuring out what seems feasible and in making the kinds of like specific arguments that we need to be making. With respect to the anthropocentrism thing, I agree with Kohei that I think a certain degree of anthropocentrism is clearly unavoidable, right? Like as you said, like we're ultimately going to be the ones having to make these kinds of like triage decisions, and there are aspects in which maintaining that division seems important, right? So like in trying to understand, for example, from my like, normative philosophy perspective, the difference between like a mass extinction caused by an asteroid and a mass extinction caused by human beings seems relevant, right? The fact that we actually can like choose to do differently, or like, if you get like attacked by a bear, you're not going to like get angry at the bear for like being a bad bear or whatever, right? In the same way that you would like get angry at a person. So there are clearly like relevant differences there, but I think the worry basically comes from extrapolating from that the idea that like we're the only ones whose interests need to be taken into account, and that a democratic decision-making process is sufficient if that's what it does. And I worry that unless we actually think seriously about this problem, we're not going to get where we need to go, because I think this is even harder than dealing with the question of future generations. I think people care about these things, but there's just going to be a structural problem that you run into, right? And I quoted in the paper Leanne Simpson talking about. She said like she didn't want to talk about capitalism for a long time, but then because she like hadn't read enough Marx or whatever. But then she said actually like indigenous peoples have seen capitalism's apocalyptic devastation on our lands and plant and animal relations, and I think that like understanding this as an apocalypse, right? Like we've lost 70% of the world's wildlife over the past 50 years. This isn't something that's just sort of like a problem for us, right? That threatens us with extinction. This is a problem for all of the other creatures with whom we share the planet. And I think until we're able to incorporate that more centrally into our political vision, we still have a problem, personally.
Okay, I want to thank all three of our speakers for a really, really excellent comradely discussion of a series of challenging and difficult questions for the socialist left. And I want to thank all of our donors who attended this evening and provided such good questions for the ongoing discussion. And I just want to encourage everyone who is listening, whether right now in the original broadcast or in the future, to please, if you want to see these sorts of discussions continue, both on the web, in print, in these sorts of webinars, etc., please subscribe to Spectre and become a monthly donor. That financial support is really crucial for us to continue to be able to sponsor these sorts of discussions, whether in print, on the web, or in these webinars. And again, thank you to Kohei, Holly, and Dan for a really excellent discussion. Thank you and good night.